Good evening, everyone. I hope you all had a great day. Can you just let me know if you can see me, if you can hear me, and if you can see the PPT? You should see a slide that is entitled Monopoly and X-INEFFICIENCY. Okay, good. Thanks everyone for joining this webinar tonight. So this is the continuation of this series of webinars related to market structures. We started talking about perfect competition. I organized 2 webinars to cover everything that there is to know about perfect competition. And last week I organized a webinar about monopoly, the second market structure that we study, especially in A2. And because this is a big topic, I only covered the definition of what the monopoly market is. I explained how we can find the equilibrium in a monopoly market. And I made a comparison in terms of consumer surplus, producer surplus, total surplus, and deadweight loss between what we have in perfect competition and what we have in a monopoly market. And this was the occasion for us to discuss about economic efficiency. Do we achieve economic efficiency in a monopoly market? And of course, the answer was no. So if you have not attended these webinars, you can find the recordings at, well, 2 different places. You can directly watch these recordings on my website. You just have to type webinar in the search box and you will find the recording. Or you can visit my YouTube channel, which is just called EconDoctor. And all recordings are also uploaded on my YouTube channel. Today, we will finish this topic on monopoly. There are basically 2 things that we have to do. We have to talk about the advantages and disadvantages of a monopoly market. In particular, we will talk about X-inefficiency. We'll talk about economies of scale, and we will spend some time to investigate one particular type of monopoly that we call natural monopoly, and that is related to the existence of economies of scale. So this is mostly what we will do: advantages, disadvantages, and then in the second part, a more detailed analysis of a natural monopoly. And the next webinar that will probably be scheduled tomorrow will be about price discrimination. And then we will be able to move on and to talk about other market structures. Good. All right, so let's do that. Are you ready? Let's talk about X-inefficiency, which is one limitation or one disadvantage of having businesses that have a market power. So this is true in a monopoly market, but more generally speaking, this is true in any market structure in which firms have some degree of market power. So we could argue that even oligopolists suffer from X-inefficiencies, and even monopolistically competitive firms, they might also suffer from X-inefficiency, even though because they have a much weaker market power, we can suspect that the extent or the size of this inefficiency is likely to be much smaller than in the case of a monopoly. All right, let's have a look at that. So what do we call X-inefficiency? Well, first some background information. You can teach the concept of X-inefficiency in a very intuitive way. You can ask your students about something like a sports competition. For For example, if you ask them about basketball, you can pretend that they are part of a very strong team and they have to play against a very weak team. And in this case, you can ask them, if you play against a very weak team, do you really think that you as a player, you are going to play your best basketball, that you are going to play as well as you can to unleash your full potential? And the answer in this case is likely to be, well, not really, not necessarily. If the team against which we play is made of very weak players, we don't have to do much effort to win the game. But on the other hand, if your team plays against a very strong team, and it's likely that you might lose the game if you do not play your best basketball, then in this case, you have much stronger incentives to really do your best, to be focused, to have a good physical preparation, a good mental preparation, to work as well as you can with your teammates. And in this case, it's likely that altogether, your team will perform much better. Why? Simply because there is a stronger competitive threat. In the first case, when you were playing against a very weak team, the competitive pressure is actually weak as well. So in this case, it's not really worth it. It's not necessary to do everything necessary to achieve your full potential, to unleash your full potential. But in the second case, when you play against a very strong team, the competitive pressure is much stronger. And in this case, you have much stronger incentives to perform as well as you can. And the same thing goes with businesses. When businesses, they face no competitive pressure or an extremely weak competitive pressure, they do not have strong incentives to achieve or to allocate their resources or to use the resources and their inputs in particular to their full potential. Basically, you can tell your students that when businesses, they face a weak competitive pressure, they tend or they may become a bit lazy. That's the idea. So in the absence of competitive pressure, the monopolist, or again, generally speaking, any firm with a strong market power, they have little incentives to cut costs. As a result, the average total cost of a monopolist tends to be higher than that of a perfectly competitive firm. Again, a perfectly competitive firm has much stronger incentive to reduce costs as much as possible. So what does it mean to reduce costs as much as possible? It means that for a given level of output, let's say that you want to produce 100 units, you will use as few resources as possible. You will not waste resources by having more workers or more machines than the minimum quantity that is required to produce this level of output. You could also argue that this concept of X-inefficiency could be about the combination of factors of production, that when you face a weak competitive pressure, you might not have strong incentives to make research or to try different possible combinations of factors of production in order to find the one that will allow you to produce a given level of output at minimum cost. Remember that when we studied efficiency, this is what we call cost efficiency, which is a long-run strategy in which you combine factors of production that are seen as substitutable in order to find the combination that will allow you to produce a given level of output at minimum cost. But usually when we talk about X-inefficiencies, we usually talk about a failure to achieve technical efficiency. Remember that technical efficiency, to put it in simple words, it's the idea that the factors of production that are hired by a business, could be the machines, could be the workers, that they are used to their full potential. Which means that if you buy a machine that can produce 100 toothbrushes per day, then this machine is actually going to produce 100 toothbrushes per day. okay? The machine is not going to be underused. It will not remain idle. If you have, let's say, 10 employees and that their maximum productive potential would be 20 cell phones per day, then your employees will actually produce this maximum amount of output. Okay? And the problem we have with firms that have a strong market power is that since they might become a bit lazy, and this is connected to the management of this organization, then it is possible, and it is more likely than in the case of a perfectly competitive firm, that these resources, these factors of production will not be used to their full potential. This is sometimes something that we call organizational slack. Well, when your workers, they can take it easy simply because the management is not keen on making sure that everyone is working as hard as they can. And why is the case that the management is not so keen or is not making sure that this is the case? Simply because even though workers, they do not work as much as hard as they could, then it's no big deal because this big firm faces no competitive threat. So it can survive, it can still make profit, even though the factors of productions are not used to their full potential. Okay, so some potential explanations. I started to give some leads on what can create X inefficiencies. So this could be poor human resource management, employees, workers who are not necessary for the productive process. So when you hire more than the necessary number of workers, perhaps a task could be completed by 10 workers, but there are currently 12 workers that are hired by the organization. So there is an amount, a quantity of labor that is not useful to the production. You could do better, or you could achieve the same objective with fewer factors of production, with fewer resources. So there, of course, it suggests that there is a higher than necessary cost of production. This could be that the business is not making efforts to find the cheapest supplier. Perhaps this big company has been working with the same supplier of raw materials for some time, for 5 years. And even though this is not the cheapest supplier, this monopolist makes the decision to keep working with this supplier. And as you can imagine, this is something that might not be possible in perfect competition. Even if you have a very good relationship with your supplier, even if you have worked for many years with the same supplier, if it is more expensive than the competitors, and if you face a very strong competitive pressure, you might be unable to keep working with this expensive supplier. But in a monopoly market, because again, you are not exposed to any competitive threat, you might continue to source raw materials from a high cost supplier. And therefore your average cost of production will be higher than what it could be in perfect competition. There might be political interests. It's interesting to think about that, especially when we think of public monopolies or monopolies that are run by governmental organizations. In this case, there might be a situation where, especially for workers, for labor in general, it is possible that this organization deliberately chooses to hire more workers than necessary. Again, they could produce a given level of output with fewer workers, but the objective of hiring more than the necessary or the minimum number of workers could be one way to reduce unemployment. For example, we want to give a job to those who are unemployed, to reduce figures, the unemployment figures. This might have some political benefits for those who are running the country. So even though they are not really needed in the organization, it's one way to give them a job. And again, this is one reason for X inefficiencies, because you could achieve a given level of production with fewer workers. And there might be a lack of management control, again, because there is no competitive threat. So there is a how can I put this? The need to make sure that all your resources are used to their full potential is not as important as a situation in which an organization faces very, very strong competition. Yeah, a firm does not supervise its workers effectively, then labor productivity may fall as workers take it easy. This is also one possibility that is quite common in public organization, in public monopolies, for example. Okay, all right, and I'll talk about that later. I'll talk about the incentives to invest in research and development when we will ask a very simple question. Is a monopolist more or less likely than a competitive firm to invest in research and development? And we see that the answer to that question is not straightforward. Good. How can we represent X inefficiency on a diagram? So this is not a super important diagram. I don't know if I know. I did not add the one step further star. It's okay if your students, they do not represent this inefficiency graphically, but I have tried to use a diagram that makes sense to illustrate this concept. So what you can do is to represent two ATC curves. You could actually also do the total cost curve, because if you do not minimize your total cost for one given level of output, you do not minimize your average total cost as well. This is equivalent. But usually when we talk about X inefficiencies, we talk about the average total cost curve. So this is the ATC curve of a monopolist. Okay, so for example, if the monopolist wants to produce 10 units of output, it will hire 5 units of capital, 5 machines. K is the number of capital, the quantity of capital equipment, 5 machines, and L is the number of workers, labor, 10 workers. Okay, so that is the combination of factors of production that the monopolist chooses to produce 10 units of output. And we see that in that case, the average total cost is $10. So the total cost would be $100. Okay, how about perfect competition? So the idea is that the average total cost of a perfectly competitive firm would be lower simply because for each level of output, so I only took one, but you can imagine for each level of output, a perfectly competitive firm will use fewer resources than a monopolist. And if we use fewer resources for given input prices, then the cost of production is going to be lower. So for example, let's say that a perfectly competitive firm, to produce the same quantity of output as our monopolist, would still use 5 machines. It's just an example. But instead of 10 workers, this perfectly competitive firm would only hire 9 workers, which suggests that this monopolist hires too many workers. It could perform the same job, produce 10 units of output with fewer workers. So we see that the average total cost of production, and sorry, this is not, the value here is not $10, it's just, I haven't given any value for the average total cost, but what we see here is that the average total cost in a perfectly competitive market would be lower than that of a monopolist. And the difference, but it doesn't really matter, would be the price of labor, because the difference is just one worker. So the difference in total cost is we have to pay one more salary, one more wage, and the wage is PL, the price of labor. And because this is the ATC, we have to divide by the quantity, 10 units, and this would be the difference in average total cost between a perfectly competitive firm and a monopolist. Okay, good. Do you have any questions about X inefficiency before we move on and talk about dynamic efficiency? Anything at all? Please let me know. Is this clear? Okay, no questions? All right, let's move on then. Let's have a quick look at dynamic efficiency. So for those, let me use this as an opportunity to remind everyone that on Saturday and Sunday this week, I will lead a workshop that is organized by Cambridge, by CIE. It's going to be a 2-day workshop, well, 2-day workshop, but only 1 hour every day. So it's not going to be very long. And these 2 workshops will be specifically dedicated to how we can teach economic efficiency in A2. And I will talk about dynamic efficiency in further detail on Saturday during part A. So feel free to join this workshop if you want to know more, and if you want to learn some strategies on how you can approach allocative, productive, dynamic, static, Pareto optimality. There are many different concepts of efficiency. So yeah, feel free to join, and we'll be very happy to share some ideas with you and to answer any question that you may have. So I'm not going to say too much about dynamic efficiency today. Just in a nutshell, dynamic efficiency is efficiency over time. The opposite is static efficiency. Static means that it's efficiency measured at one point in time. It's like the difference between static and dynamic efficiency. You can see static efficiency as a picture and dynamic efficiency as a video. So one happens just at one point in time, and the other is over a given period of time. But to put it simply, you can say that static efficiency is efficiency in the short run, and dynamic efficiency is efficiency measured or evaluated, assessed over the long run, over a longer period of time. So there are many examples that you can use to illustrate the trade-off between static efficiency and dynamic efficiency, and I will talk about that on Saturday. But in A2, when we talk about dynamic efficiency, we mostly talk about R&D and innovation, research and development, technological change, because there is indeed a trade-off between the short run and the long run. Our research and development is a very long process. In the pharmaceutical industry, to develop a new drug, it takes on average 12 years. That's an average. And the average cost of research and development in this pharmaceutical industry is over $1 billion US. And of course, there is a lot of uncertainty. You don't know if your R&D project is going to succeed. Maybe you will fail, or maybe you will fail to introduce your innovation before a competitor. There is an aspect of rivalry in research and development, and this is actually what my PhD was about. So again, when we talk about dynamic efficiency, and when we ask, will a certain business or organization or economic agent, even government, will this economic agent achieve dynamic efficiency, yes or no? This question essentially means, will this economic agent sufficiently invest in research and development to introduce new products, new processes, and to achieve technological change? So this is mostly, at least for A2, for CIE, this is mostly what dynamic efficiency is about. So when we think of a monopolist, and again, we try to compare this situation where one business has a very strong market power, we try to compare this with a market structure in which you have many small firms. Would you say that a monopolist is more likely to invest in research and development than a very small competitive business? And it's not straightforward to answer that question, because there are two opposite effects. On the one hand, you have the issue of incentives. Competitive firms, they are exposed to a very strong competitive threat. And in this case, they have strong incentives to innovate, to invest in research and development, to innovate. There are two types of innovations, two main types of innovations. You can have process innovations, and you can have product innovations. Process innovations are innovations about your production process. And usually a process innovation will allow you to produce at a lower cost. This could be that you have developed a new machine, that you have created a new production process, anything that will allow you to produce at a lower cost. So of course, for a perfectly competitive firm, this would be very interesting to be able to achieve this type of innovation, because they would be able to produce at a lower cost than their competitors. And in this case, they might be able to make profit even in a perfectly competitive market and even in the long run. This assuming that they can be the only one using their innovation, because sometimes in perfect competition, we make the assumption that information is perfect, which would suggest that all the other firms that could have access to the innovation, but there might be some patents, there might be some intellectual property of some kind, but usually the idea is that process innovations are very appealing or attractive in a competitive market, because this is one way to gain a competitive advantage over your competitors, over your rivals. So my point is that the incentives to innovate in a perfectly competitive market are very strong. In a monopoly, on the other hand, the incentives are much weaker, because again, especially if we focus on process innovation, because again, we don't face any competition. So, okay, we might be able to make more profit if we have a lower cost of production, but this is not a question of survival. In perfect competition, it is a question of survival. So the incentives to achieve a process innovation in a monopolist tend to be weaker than in perfect competition. Then there is the idea of product innovation. Product innovation is when you introduce or improve the quality or the features of what you already sell. So this could be you increase the speed of a processor, you increase the size of a screen, you develop a new technology for smartphones or fridges or anything. And again, this could be one way you know that product differentiation creates market power. If you manage to differentiate your products from your competitors, this is one way to reduce the intensity of competition. This will give you some control over the price. Product differentiation gives you some market power and makes you price maker to some extent. And therefore, you might be able to make some profit. So again, in a perfectly competitive market, the achievement of product innovations, again, is extremely appealing, because this would be one way for a business to differentiate its product and to reduce the intensity of competition and to make more profit at the end of the day. In a monopolist, again, there is, of course, an incentive to achieve product innovation, because they might be able to stimulate or to increase the demand for their product. They might reduce the elasticity of demand. They might be able to charge a higher price for the new features of the product. But again, economists tend to believe that these incentives are weaker than in perfect competition, perhaps because, again, in a monopolist, this is not a matter of survival for this big organization, whereas in perfect competition, they need to be able to reduce the intensity of competition and to create unique selling points, to use a business vocabulary, in order to survive in this environment. So overall, the incentives to innovate tend to be weaker in a monopoly. But there is something else that we have to take into account. It's the ability to innovate. Because as I said, as I explained, it is usually extremely expensive to innovate and to achieve a product or a process innovation. On the one hand, monopolists, they tend to have a greater ability to invest in research and development, for one simple reason, is that they are able to make abnormal or positive profit in the long run. So which means that they can make profit during the time they are engaged in research and development, and they can use this profit that they make in the long run to finance, to fund their research and development programs. On the other hand, a perfectly competitive firm, you know that they make zero economic profit in the long run, so they might not have the funds necessary to be able to carry out a research and development process, to invest in research and development. You can also add something about that. You can say that a monopolist is more likely to survive and to still be there in the market in 10 years than a very small firm in operating in a perfectly competitive market. It's more likely that a small competitive firm will go bankrupt than a big monopoly that enjoys a significant market power. So when you look at the trade-off between static and dynamic efficiency, investing in research and development is likely to be considered more risky for a competitive firm that does not even know if it will still be there in 10 years or 20 years, rather than in a monopoly market where this big business is confident that it will still be there in this market in 20 years. So this is also something that we have to take into account to understand the difference between in the ability of investing in research and development. So then you could say, yes, okay, perfectly competitive firms, they do not make any economic profit in the long run, sure, but they might borrow some money. Yeah, they could go to their bank and say, hey, can I have a loan? I have a research and development project, and then can you please lend me some money so I can undertake this project? Well, there are several things that we could say about that. Yes, theoretically it is possible, but of course what you could argue is that R&D is a very risky type of investment. You don't know when you will succeed. You don't know exactly what type of innovation you will introduce. Your innovation might have become obsolete when you introduce it. You might be defeated by a rival in an innovation race. So from the point of view of a bank, it's not very likely that they will agree to make use this type of loan, especially if you are a very small firm that is likely to go bankrupt in just a few years. So yeah, overall, I think you get my point. My point is that even though monopolists, they have weaker incentives to innovate, they might have a stronger ability, financial ability to undertake research and development investment. So from the point of dynamic efficiency, the conclusion is that there is no clear conclusion. It is quite difficult. So these are just summaries of what I said. This is what I write here. It is somewhat difficult to determine whether a monopolist is more likely to be dynamically efficient than a perfectly competitive firm. And then you have these two effects. And I think it's interesting if your students write an essay about the difference between perfect competition and a monopoly, I think this is a very interesting point that they have to make. On the one hand, the possibility of making abnormal profit in the long run enables the monopolist to retain some of its profit and fund lengthy and costly R&D projects. So this is about the ability to innovate. Even if a monopoly does not use its retained profit to finance R&D, it will be able to borrow funds at a lower cost than a perfectly competitive firm, simply because its investment will be regarded as less risky. Because it's a bigger company, it's more likely to be there in 20 years and to pay back the loan than a perfectly competitive firm. Okay, yeah, that's what I explained here. But let's talk about incentive. On the other hand, the absence of competition in a monopolistic market gives the monopolist little incentive to introduce new products and processes. On the other hand, perfectly competitive firms have stronger incentives to innovate in order to gain a competitive advantage over their competitors. This could be a cost advantage if they introduce a process innovation, or this could be a product advantage if they achieve a product innovation, better quality, better features, this type of things. Okay, but again, perfectly competitive firm, they have a questionable survival in the long run, so they may be hesitant to engage in costly and lengthy research and development projects. So yeah, it's difficult. It's difficult to tell whether or not a monopolist is more or less likely to achieve dynamic efficiency than a perfectly competitive firm. Good. Any questions at that stage? Before we can talk about the last point, before we can talk about economies of scale. there anything you'd like to ask about what I just explained, this trade-off or this issue between incentives, ability in a competitive market, in a monopolistic market? You can just, okay, let's implement a code. I'm sure we can share some smileys, right? So if you are happy and if you are ready to move on, you can just share a happy face. How did you do that, Mo? I don't see the smiley face on. No. Okay, doesn't matter. Okay, but if you are happy, you can just share a happy face and we can move on. Or if you are unhappy, you can just do that. But then you have to tell me why you are unhappy. I will need an explanation. All right, so we talked about X inefficiency, which is clearly a problem that we have in a monopolistic market. We talked about dynamic efficiency. It's not clear whether or not it's an advantage or disadvantage because we have these two opposite effects. Now I'm going to talk about a clear advantage, and that's probably the most important advantage of having a concentrated market. Could be a monopoly, of course, but this is also the case in an oligopoly. As soon as you just have few firms that produce a large output, then each firm is likely to benefit from economies of scale to produce at a lower average total cost, and therefore with a lower cost of production, they might be able to charge lower prices to the consumer. So this is a clear advantage of a monopoly. Let me explain that. So the fact that we have one single seller in the market implies that the monopolist is likely to operate at a very large scale of production, simply because this monopolist is going to supply the entire market. This monopolist is facing the entire market demand, so it will produce a greater output than an individual firm in perfect competition. Be careful. The overall quantity that will be produced in perfect competition will be larger, usually, than the overall quantity produced in a monopoly. But my point is that the quantity produced by the monopolist is going to be much larger than the quantity produced by one perfectly competitive firm. Okay, so if we have an industry where IEOS, it stands for internal economies of scale. You know that there is a difference between internal and external. So let's just focus on internal economies of scale. So if the cost structure in this industry is such that your average cost of production decreases significantly as you increase your output, then a monopolist can produce any given level of output at a lower total cost and long-run average total cost, because remember that the concept of economies of scale, it's a long-run concept, than if supply was made of many smaller businesses. And we say, I don't know if I use this keyword, yeah, we say that the total cost function is sub-additive. This is, I will show you why we use this keyword, but this is essentially what it means. We have a sub-additive total cost function. Okay, so you see, this is how we can put it. The total cost of producing Q1 plus Q2 is smaller than the total cost of producing Q1 plus the total cost of producing Q2. So this would be, for example, let's say that we have one single firm that produces the entire output itself, Q1 plus Q2. So this is a function, right? TC, it's not a product, it's a function. So TC is the total cost function, and Q1 plus Q2 is the total output. So the total cost of producing the total output is smaller than a situation in which you would have two firms, each of them producing let's say half. Okay, so one firm is going to produce Q1 on its own, and the other one is going to produce Q2 on its own. So you see that it's actually cheaper to centralize production in just one single business than to separate it between two business units, two distinct business units. This is what we call subadditivity in mathematics. Okay, and why is this an advantage? Because you could say, okay, what's the point? The monopolist is going to be able to produce at a lower cost. Okay, so what? Well, there are two things you could say. You could say, and this is the first point, you could say that with a lower cost, lower average cost of production, this may translate into lower price and higher output in a monopoly than in perfect competition. So this depends on many factors. So that's why I underline the may. It depends on the extent of the economies of scale. It depends on the price elasticity of demand and so on. But the idea is that if really producing a large output enables the monopoly to save on production costs, even though the monopoly has a market power and can charge a price above its marginal cost, this higher price might still be lower than the price in perfect competition. Because the point is that in perfect competition, firms have no market power, so they have to charge a price equal to the marginal cost. They are unable to raise the price above their marginal cost. But the fact that they operate at a very small scale of production means that they have a pretty high marginal cost. You could put it this way. They have a high average cost and they also have a high marginal cost. So they cannot charge a price above their marginal cost, okay? But this marginal cost is very high because they cannot enjoy, they cannot benefit from economies of scale. Well, if you take a monopolist, this monopolist has a market power, so it can charge a price above its marginal cost. But its marginal cost is much lower than in perfect competition. So even if we charge a price above our marginal cost, it might still be lower than in perfect competition. That's the basic idea. Okay. So we say, yes, a monopoly is not good for consumers because they charge a price that is too high. They produce a quantity that is too low. And therefore this leads to a deadweight loss. Okay, we do not maximize total surplus. There is a deadweight loss. Yes, this is true. But remember, when we compare perfect competition and monopoly, we make one very important assumption. We assume that the supply curve in perfect competition is the same as the marginal cost of the monopolist. This assumption that we make to compare monopoly and perfect competition means that we assume that when we move from perfect competition to monopoly, the monopoly does not enjoy any economies of scale. But the existence of this deadweight loss can be mitigated or reduced. We can have a smaller deadweight loss if moving from perfect competition to a monopolistic market leads to economies of scale. To put it differently, that now the monopolies can enjoy significant economies of scale. Right, so this is how you can represent it. You can do that on the whiteboard with your students. So let's say we want to produce 100 units. So there are two things we can do. So this is the long run average total cost. We see that it is decreasing. So there are significant economies of scale. And I have stopped there, so we do not see the point beyond which we start to experience these economies of scale. So we could produce, that's our objective. We want to produce 100 units. And let's say there are two ways we can do that. We can just say to one business, you are going to produce 100 units by yourself. Centralized production in one just business. Or we can choose to ask 10 businesses, 10 different businesses to produce 10 units each. Okay. At the end of the day, we will always have 100 units. Okay. But which option will allow us to produce these 100 units at the lowest total cost? Well, you see that if we just ask one business to produce 100 units, for this level of output, the ATC is $5. So the total cost of production will be $500. Okay. So that's the option. That's represent the monopoly. One firm produces the entire output. But if we ask 10 different businesses, each of them to produce 10 units, so each of them will have an average cost of $20 simply because they have a much lower output, so they cannot enjoy substantial economies of scale. So each of them, in order to produce 10 units, will have a total cost of 20 times 10, $200. Which means that in order to produce 100 units overall, we have 10 firms, each of them having a total cost of $200. So the total cost would be $2,000 to produce 100 units. So this simple example shows you that it is indeed much cheaper to centralize production in one single business organization, one business that produces the entire industry output at a total cost of $500, rather than dividing production between smaller businesses, each of them producing a fraction of the industry output. And you see that the difference here is quite significant. Of course, this is not meant to be realistic, but this is a clear example of a subadditive total cost function. Yes, so the total cost of producing 100 units is smaller than 10 times the total cost of producing 10 units. Good. What time is it? Yes, so, yeah, I think it's a bit late to start talking about natural monopoly, simply because I want to, well, I want to introduce this specific market structure. And I also want to talk about government intervention, what the government can do to regulate a natural monopoly. So I want to talk about price regulation, marginal cost pricing, average cost pricing, state provision, this type of thing. So I don't want to rush, and I don't want this webinar to be too long. So instead of doing this today, I'm going to do that tomorrow, to focus on a natural monopoly tomorrow. And perhaps if we have time to start price discrimination. Otherwise, I'm afraid this webinar is going to be too long. I was told by Cambridge that webinars that are longer than 1 hour are difficult to follow, that everybody is exhausted, and I don't want to exhaust anyone. All right, so I'm going to stop here. Before we stop, do you have any questions on the existence of economies of scale in a monopolistic market? Any question about that, or any questions about anything that I have discussed today, or any feedback, anything you want to say before we conclude this webinar tonight? Please let me know. Happy faces? What case study do you study in the course of teaching? You mean real life examples of monopoly? Is this what you mean, Shogun? It is actually a difficult question because just like in perfect competition, there is no clear example of monopolies that would be private monopolies. Try to think of an example of a private monopoly. It's very difficult to find examples. There are two types of pure monopolies, because sometimes the problem we have with economics is that sometimes definitions that we use in economics are different from definitions that students use in business. And this might be a bit confusing for students. And the definition of a monopoly market is a good example, because many of my students have, when I start, teaching monopoly and we talk about the definition of this market structure, some of them have already studied that in business, and they tell me something like a monopoly is a firm whose market share is greater than 50% or something like that. I don't know exactly how, because I'm not a business teacher, so perhaps there are some business teachers among you. But basically, the way they define it is not the same way as we define a monopoly in economics. In economics, this is again a theoretical market structure in which you have one business that has 100% market share. So when you think about that, there is no, to my knowledge, no example of pure monopoly. The closest example that you can use is what we call a dominant firm. Same thing. They are not monopolies. They are what we call dominant firms. Which a dominant firm is a dominant firm structure is a market structure in which you have one firm that has a very large market share, could be 70%, 80%, almost 90%, but they are still always competitors. If you take the example of Taobao, they are competitors. Let me give you an example. I actually use the example of Taobao, and I will show that to you in a second. Let me find it. Where is it? I think it's there. Yeah. Introduction to market structures. Yeah. All right, you see? This is the market you just want to make sure that you see the right PPT. All right. Look at this example. This is the China's business to customer online shopping website. So you see that, all right, you have Taobao, right? I think, I'm not familiar, but I think Tmall is Taobao. And you see, so this is okay, this is from 2016, so this might have changed. But you see that they are very, very far from being a monopoly. 50% market share, it's huge. It's huge, but still there are many competitors. So I don't really like to use these examples to illustrate a monopoly market because they are not really monopoly markets. They are more like oligopolies or dominant firm markets. So to me, the best examples, if we want to be precise, if we really want to give examples of markets that are truly monopolies, you can use two examples. You can use public monopolies or legal monopolies, which is a situation in which the supply of a particular good or service is under the monopoly control of the government. So in this case, it is a monopoly simply because nobody else can provide it. And you're right, Shogun, these are usually natural monopolies, utilities, for example, because it is usually cost efficient to centralize the production of goods in which there are substantial economies of scale. So natural monopolies are usually public monopolies. It is true. So it's a good example that you can give. You can talk about utilities, provision of electricity, of gas, of water. In many countries, it is under the monopoly control of a local government. So it is a good example. Same thing, Didi is, if we want to be precise, this is not going to be a pure monopoly simply because there are other providers, to my knowledge. If you want to go from point A to point B, you don't have, with a taxi, you are not forced to take a Didi. When I arrive in my hometown by train, I can take a Didi or I can take a standard cab, right? So this is not going to be, to me, in my opinion, a good example of a monopoly. Again, this is an example of a dominant firm market. And this is not the same as a monopoly. This is very different. I can share information about this market structure, but the problem is that it is not studied in A2. What Okay, so you could talk about natural monopolies, yes, which are often public monopolies. In this case, or for example, some goods and services, only the government can produce them. I don't know how this works, but anything related to national defense, I'm not sure, but about weapons, is this okay for a private company or private business in China to produce weapons to supply the army? I would say, again, I haven't made research about that, but I would assume that the production of weapons for the army and military equipment is under the monopoly control of the Chinese government. But again, this is just an assumption. Perhaps they import some equipment, but I'd be surprised. Yeah, railway company is an example of a natural monopoly, absolutely, and it can be controlled by the government. So in this case, this would be a good example of a monopoly. The other type of monopoly that you can illustrate, which is a precise example of monopoly, is the case of intellectual property. When you have one company that has achieved an innovation and has been granted a patent for some time, it could be 15 to 20 years, then in this case, by law, this company will be the only one allowed to sell its product. Even though there are many businesses who would have the ability to do so, it is forbidden. So this is the case in the pharmaceutical industry. This could be for high-tech equipment. This could be for anything related to high technology, usually. High technology, new medications, things like that. So if I, for example, if I have developed a vaccine for the COVID-19, and if I have received a patent, and hopefully this is not going to happen this way, because this vaccine, I hope that everybody will be able to purchase it at a reasonable price, or even for free. But let's say that there is this new vaccine that has been developed by a pharmaceutical company. In this case, if it is granted a patent, this pharmaceutical company will be a legal monopoly, absolutely. A monopoly by law, because it is protected by the IP laws. So rather than using examples of Taobao, Didi, which are not precise examples or not clear examples of monopoly, especially because you have different companies selling differentiated products. To me, it's just, we overcomplicate things if we use this type of examples. I would rather use examples of patents and public monopolies, which clearly match the definition that we give. One single seller, many buyers, high barriers to entry. When you are a natural monopoly or a public monopoly, the government tells you, I am the only one producing. Well, this is a barrier to entry. And the patent is a barrier to entry as well. And no close substitute. Well, in the case of natural monopolies, this is usually utilities like water, gas, electricity. These are things with no substitutes. And in the case of patents, if you are the only one who has developed an innovation, and if you want to be granted a patent, your innovation must be significantly different from everything else that is already in the market. If you just do something slightly different from what is already there, you will not be granted a patent. So if you have a patent, it means that you have achieved something significantly different. And therefore, there is no close substitute to your process or product innovation. So these two examples precisely match the definition and the criteria or the characteristics of a monopoly market. So I would encourage you to use these examples. If you want to talk about Taobao, Didi, I would rather use these examples when talking about concentration ratios as an introduction to market structures. In my slides, I talk about this business to customers online shopping websites, smartphone market shares, airline market shares. This is a good time to talk about businesses, companies that your students know, and to connect and to talk to them. And you can even ask them to complete some kind of homework where they would have to collect this type of data and to make conclusions in terms of how concentrated the market is. But when we find examples when we want to illustrate a monopoly market: legal monopoly, IP, and public monopolies, often natural monopolies. All right, any other questions? And we'll talk about natural monopolies tomorrow. Anything else? Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Mostly, I talk about the Standard Oil when I start talking about public policy, about antitrust policy. And this is something that I will do tomorrow when we talk about natural monopoly, about the regulation of natural monopoly. I talk about breaking up a monopoly. Is this a good idea? Is this a good idea to break up a monopoly? In the case of a natural monopoly, it's not a good idea, but if the monopoly is not natural, which means that if there are not significant economies of scale in this industry, then it might be a good idea. So I do talk about antitrust policies, and of course, I go back to the Standard Oil example. So absolutely, I think it's great if the students have some historical background about antitrust policy, mostly in the US. You can give examples of the famous antitrust laws that have been passed in the US, to find examples in the UK, and to find examples in China as well, to see what type of antitrust policies are implemented, are currently implemented in China, what governmental agencies responsible for investigating market and analyzing the extent to which firms are behaving in a competitive way. I think this is very interesting to talk about that to your students. Yes. Yes, about your last point about the what we call the GAFAs. It is true that there was actually used that last year with my students, not A2 students, but my IFY students, because they had to write a coursework that was related to that was related about should we design some kind of new antitrust policies specifically designed to reduce the power of the GAFAs, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, Microsoft as well. So again, this type of examples is extremely relevant, especially because they do know these companies. I came up with something funny that I can share with you, because, you know, we call that, okay, this is not something that is very serious, but let's do that. So we have the GAFAs, which is Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple. Sometimes we call it the GAFAMs to add Microsoft. So I asked the students, okay, what would be the equivalent in China if we wanted to use the biggest companies and to use their letters, their first letters, to make an acronym. So they told me, okay, we have Baidu, we have Alibaba, we have Tencent, and we have, they told me Huawei. They have, these are the top companies that they mentioned. And if you look at the four first letter, it makes bath. So why not? You can take a bath in this four big company. I don't know. It's just something funny that you can do with them. You can, they can come up with something else if they find different companies. Perhaps we could include other Chinese companies, but why not? Something interesting. So yeah, using using press article, newspapers article about these debates, these congressional hearings with Facebook, as you said, is especially something that I think would be interesting about Facebook. So there were several congressional hearings. There is one that I think was particularly interesting, was the one about the Libra, the cryptocurrency that Facebook is planning to introduce, which might challenge the typical financial system. And it was striking how Congress was, let's say, worried about this project. So this particular congressional hearing, I found it extremely interesting. And this is something that I would definitely share with my students. Yeah, basically I can show you a monopoly. You can use some what we call potatoes if you want. You can use potatoes to let me use the whiteboard. Right. You can use different potatoes to represent market structures. So okay, you have this one, and if you just have, I'll try to do something similar. Oops. No, that's not a good start. Sorry. Okay. If you have like something like that, all right, well, you have basically you have the total market, and inside you just have one big business that has the entire market share. Okay, you could say this is a monopoly. M for monopoly. This is supposed to be the entire market share. Okay. Then if you have, let's say this is your big market, and you would have something like, I don't know, 2 businesses, 2 or 3 businesses. You could say, okay, this is an oligopoly. If you have a market where you have one big business and then many tiny businesses, well, I'm not going to represent 200, but many small businesses, then this is a dominant market, where this big business here dominates the market. But still, this big firm does not have a 100% market share. They are the businesses. The assumption that we make in this market is that the big business is price maker. It sets the price, and the small firms, they act like competitive firm. They take the price that has been made by this dominant firm. So this is not something we study in A2, but you see it's different from a monopoly where there is no one else, just have one firm. And this would be oligopoly. And perfect competition would just be something like many small businesses. We say that the supply is atomistic, many small atoms. Each of them is a business. Yeah, so yeah, please avoid using examples like Taobao, Didi. They are not pure monopolies. It might just confuse your students. Any other comment, remark, question, feedback, anything? Shoot. Are we good for today? I did take a break, Shugang. I did take a 3 or 4 day break. It's okay. Oh, you mean today? Yeah. It's fine. No problem. The objective would be to have this type of webinars to cover the entire AS and A2 syllabus. So it will take some time. Stick with me. We'll make it. All right. Then I'll stop here for today. The recording will be made available in a few hours on my website and on my YouTube channel. As always, if you have any questions, you know how to contact me. And tomorrow, the webinar will be dedicated to natural monopoly. And if we have some time, we'll also talk about price discrimination. But I don't want to be too optimistic. This would be a bit too long, perhaps. So we will probably focus on natural monopoly and antitrust policy, which I believe is very interesting, very practical. All right, good night, everyone. Have a good day tomorrow. And hopefully you will join for the rest of this series of webinars on market structures. Good night, everyone.